Hi, and welcome to the Right to Remain Silent podcast. I'm Jim Weber, your host and guide through actual accounts of intriguing and fascinating true crime stories as told by the law enforcement professional that experienced the event. The Right to Remain Silent podcast makes no exaggeration of fact, doesn't glamorize details, or sensationalize reality. The format here is basic. Real stories from real cops. Lastly, please don't forget to like, follow, subscribe, and share. Doing this will help me continue to provide you, the listener, with captivating and relevant true crime stories. Now, let's listen in on today's episode. Hi, and welcome to today's episode of the Right to Remain Silent True Crime Podcast. I'm your host, Jim Weber, and today's guest is Dr. Jeff Meldrum, Professor of Anatomy and Anthropology in the Department of Biological Sciences at Idaho State University. Dr. Meldrum, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Well, my pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
Certainly. Well, I just wanted to give listeners a little bit of a background on you. So I'm just going to read your bio here, if that would be all right.
Sure, you betcha.
All right, here we go. Dr. Jeff Meldrum is a full professor of anatomy and anthropology at Idaho State University since 1993. His research centers on the evolution of hominin bipedalism. His professional interest in the footprints attributed to Sasquatch began when he personally examined a line of 15-inch tracks in 1996. Over 25 years later, his lab houses well over 300 footprint casts attributed to relic hominoids around the world. He is the author of Sasquatch, Legend Meets Science. He is an editor-in-chief of the scholarly refereed journal, The Relic Hominid Inquiry, now in its 13th year. Again, thank you for taking the time to be here today.
Pleasure.
All right. What I thought we might do is start out with, why did Dr. Meldrum get into the field of science and research and teaching? Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. And I think it's important for kids to have kids, young and old,
Yep.
to have a notion of how something like this comes about. Because I tell you, I didn't have a clue. I had no role models at that age as far as a career in science. It was a scientist was this mysterious figure in the movies and on television wearing the white lab coat or out in the Arctic tundra,
Right.
being chased by polar bears or something like that. But um, so but I grew up at least with well, thankfully, not at least, uh, with parents who were very supportive of my brother and my interests, and I gravitated always towards the natural sciences, and they this was back before the day of the internet, and so if you were concerned about your child's education and you could afford it, then there was either a World Book encyclopedia set or some
Oh,
other
yeah.
equivalent
Yep.
reference materials. And in addition to that, of course, we were faithful subscribers to the Time Life Nature Library, and which I devoured, and we even had a set, what was called the International Wildlife Encyclopedia,
Hmm.
that was a set of volumes of animals, not only and richly illustrated with photographs, but also their taxonomy and their distribution and all sorts of natural history insight. So I was always bringing home um, stray animals,
Hmm.
either voluntarily or involuntarily. You know,
Yep.
it, I remember one time, I've told this story before, but my mom stopped me at the back kitchen door, from the garage, coming in from the garage, and I had a paper grocery bag kind of rolled up a little bit at the top. What's in the sack? What's in the grocery bag? Oh, nothing. Let me see. Open it up, and it's literally half full of garter snakes just writhing. I was going to introduce them to their new home, which was my bedroom, and
Wow.
so anyway, she allowed one snake in the terrarium, and that was it. But I had terraria and aquaria, and it was like a little natural history museum with all sorts of bones and various things, wasp nests and all kinds of paraphernalia from the woods. And so anyway, um, as a result, that also exposed me, especially that international wildlife encyclopedia set, introduced me to the diversity, the biodiversity of our planet beyond my backyard. And I was fascinated by primates. And of course, coming up, that this was the kind of golden age of primatology with the Jane Goodall
Hmm.
exploits with National Geographic, supported by National Geographic, and then Diane Fossey and eventually Baruti Galdikas studying the great apes in their natural habitat. And so that made a huge impact. And so that was, as most young kids trying to figure out what they're going to do. I bounced around. I was that close to being a carpenter. All
Oh,
through high
wow.
school, I was worked on a framing crew in the summers, and then in the winters I worked in a cabinet shop
Oh,
and uh,
man.
and assembled and installed cabinets, and then I did finish work. Door jambs, hanging doors, and doing all the woodwork in homes. And but I kept, coming back to what were the possibilities of a career in science. But the closest I got at that point, I mean, was veterinary medicine.
Hmm.
And I had even done my 200 hours of volunteer work at a veterinary clinic, and I was working on my undergraduate degree, and we had a very aggressive pre-med program, very competitive program. And one of the ways they winnow that field is uh, organic chemistry.
Oh,
And
wow.
while I loved organic chemistry, it took an inordinate amount of time from my other studies, my other courses. But I put in that time because I was fascinated by it. But the professor was notorious for slinging out an exam which had no resemblance to what we had talked about for the past 6 weeks in class. And so that was, that was devastating. The first time I got a D on an exam, because I was
Yeah.
always a straight A student all through high school. And anyway, um, that was sort of the downfall, quite honestly. It was so competitive to get into veterinary school at that point that I you had to have the 4.0. That was minimum. And then all
Hmm.
the other things were what differentiated you. So that's ultimately a C plus in organic chemistry. It was not a good not a feather to stick in my cap.
Well,
So,
that's why I became a police officer. I wasn't good at math and science, and I was
yeah,
envious of you guys that were great at
yeah.
that stuff. So that's funny.
Well, and so literally I can remember the day I kind of sat there and I had to think about, well, and of course, having gone to school, like I said, I was that close to becoming a finish carpenter full time.
Hmm.
But then one of the many recessions that we've experienced hit, and the building boom dried up in Boise area at that time where I was living, and the prospects were just not good. And I had on a lark, along with some of my high school buddies, gone in and done an interview. And a screening for admissions to Brigham Young University, and and I was offered a 2-year scholarship.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, so my parents, really leaned on me and said, "Look, just go and take advantage of it. Don't let that slip through your fingers.
Sure.
And if you don't like it, you want to come back and pound nails, then you can do
You
that."
can always circle back.
That's right. And of course, I fell in love with the whole environment at that time. I mean, it really was a golden era. It was kind of Camelot before all this politicization and
Hmm.
extremism and so forth. It's given academia such a black eye. It's really unfortunate and disappointing to me. But
Right.
nevertheless, I really fell in love with it. And then now I had a model. I had these my professors. These were scientists,
Sure.
and academia was one way in which scientists could make a living. And so I wondered how I might fit into that as the prospects of successfully gaining admission to a veterinary school. Well, and the recession hit veterinary schools really hard too, because people just couldn't afford the expense, without
Hmm.
insurance of veterinary care for their pets. And so small animal practices were withering on the vine. So I don't mean to go so
Mm.
far
Oh,
into
no.
weeds here, but
No, absolutely.
it's just kind of interesting in hindsight how circumstances sort of uh,
They kind of
uh,
push you in a certain direction.
exactly doors open and others close,
Right.
and so I remember one day I went down to the library. I had not had a good exposure. Well, let me back up. The anthropology department at Brigham Young University, as is the case in across various institutions, they tend to have strengths and weaknesses within the classic four disciplines, which were physical or biological anthropology, linguistics, cultural and social, and archaeology. And I wasn't, it was it turns out it was the physical anthropology that I was most interested in, but they were not well represented. The
Hmm.
emphasis was in archaeology and cultural social there on campus. And so I took a few classes for general education that were interesting, but it didn't capture my imagination. But I remember actually the day that I went to the library. I said, I got to figure out what it is that I mean, I know what I'm interested in, but what do you call it? Because I was
Sure.
interested in paleontology, I was interested in human evolution, I was interested in comparative anatomy, I was interested in evolutionary morphology, in primate behavior, and so forth, psychology, and so forth. So I was just there, literally pulling introductory textbooks off the stacks, going through the Dewey Decimal,
Hmm.
system, and eventually I pulled an introduction to physical anthropology, and boom, everything between the covers was right there in one package. I couldn't believe it. I'd never heard of this term before, and so I talked to some of the professors. I started coaching in those days. Then you would go to Peterson's Guide to Graduate Programs and look for
Hmm.
something that fell in line with that. And so I identified some of the schools. I started reaching out and wrote letters of correspondence.
Much different than today's world of shooting
Isn't
off
it though? It's
emails. Right.
just amazing. Yeah, the
Right.
difference. It's amazing. So that's how I got onto that path. And thankfully, because I had a good solid sort of a pre-med emphasis in biological anthropology or biological sciences, with a real strong background in anatomy.
Hmm.
It turns out that there were programs popping up that really emphasized where the anthropologists were actually in departments of anatomy to teach human gross anatomy, which was no longer addressed by the previous faculty were becoming more and more and more subcellular and molecular and so forth. Um, Cell, molecular, and structural biology was the name of many of these departments now. And so they hired physical anthropologists to teach the gross anatomy course. And so these hybrid graduate programs turned up. Well, I
Hmm.
was ideal for that. I mean, and it was
Sure.
right up my alley, given my interest in anatomy. And in fact, today I posted on my Facebook page a link to, because it came up on one of my other feeds, um, the paper that had a real significant influence on my focus, and that was a paper that was published by two faculty who became mentors, Jack Stern and Randall Sussman at State University of New York at Stony Brook, where I ended up doing my graduate work. And it was this quite voluminous paper called The Locomotor Anatomy of Australopithecus afarensis, or Lucy. And it was this, comprehensive comparative analysis of the fossilized skeletal remains of this early bipedal hominin, and comparing and contrasting with, modern human and non-human grade 8 skeletal anatomy, with the interpretation of the adaptations for upright posture, and in what manner of
Hmm.
bipedalism. How did Lucy walk? And that paper just embodied everything that I was fascinated by. So at that point, I looked at other programs, but that was really the one I wanted to get admission to, if that was at all possible. So I was fortunate. I got to spend, 5 years with those two um, uh, researchers, as well as, because they had quite a cluster of faculty, another four or five um, biological anthropologists of various stripe uh,
Hmm.
from various backgrounds. So anyway, that's how that kind of played out, and um, eventually I ended up here because with the desire to get further towards the west, where our roots are located.
Hmm.
And um, I did a postdoc at Duke University for a couple of years, learned a lot about dental anatomy, and had a chance to go to South America and discover a couple of new species of extinct fossil primate. Was able to go to the Northwestern Medical School, where I dabbled a bit in molecular, um, in DNA sequencing and
Hmm.
phylogenetic reconstruction and analysis from molecular data, in addition to morphological data, as we've done previously. And then, like I said, the big city was just not my cup of tea. Even as nice as Chicago was, as far as big cities go, and we
Right.
lived it was a huge commute, because extremely expensive, and a 9 month salary did not cut it for
Yeah.
living in
You
downtown
know what?
Chicago.
Ironically, I lived in Chicago as well for a
Oh,
number of years. I didn't
uh-huh.
realize that, and I wholeheartedly agree. Quite expensive, and
Yeah.
again, I'm a hillbilly from Missouri, so the
Yeah.
big city wasn't for me either.
Yeah. Yeah. And so when we kind of started looking around for to strategize, and just to see what might turn up, and this position here at Idaho State University. And a lot of people thought I was taking a huge step down. And depending on what your criteria for evaluating that move might be, that might be a justified point of view. But it wasn't an early retirement, as I was accused of by some of my colleagues. It was interesting because, a lot of my colleagues, it was just they were mystified by my decision.
I was going
And
to ask, did they try to steer you away from that?
a lot did. A number of them did. They couldn't understand why I would go to a department of biological science, and but there was one person that I knew only, by name and reputation. I think we may had met personally once at some meetings at some point. But to this day, I remember, not his name, but the the comment that he made, and he messaged me. I think by that point we had just been introduced to the internet, and so emails were just coming on online. But he said, "I really want to tell you how impressed I am." He said, "I don't know you that well, but on the basis of that decision alone, because I know you well enough to know that you made that decision for all the right reasons, because this life is too short to not make choices that best, benefit you and your family. And it was a lifestyle choice instead of living in, the greater Chicago, well, in the suburbs, way out in the suburbs,
Sure.
and then
Yeah.
have to ride a commuter train back and forth every single day for a minimum of 45 minutes to an hour and a half each way.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
Hmm.
And I always appreciated that.
Yeah.
Voice, that word, those words of affirmation, of encouragement, and respect for that decision. So, and it wasn't nearly, with the advent of the internet, it wasn't nearly as isolating as it might have been otherwise. But
Hmm.
boy, it gets to the point where, with especially now with the popularity of Zoom and
Right.
the ability to communicate like this and so forth, it's been not been a detriment at all in that respect. And it opened up other doors. That's the other thing. It
Right.
opened other opportunities that I probably wouldn't have been able to pursue in the situation I found myself in then. Had a great experience there at Northwestern. I didn't leave with any cloud over my head or anything like that. At least I don't think, from
Sure.
my point of view. I think they were probably disappointed in the fact that they had invested in a hire and a setup and so forth. But um, so that's kind of where I landed. Now, all this time, rattling around as part of this whole mixture of natural history and primates and human evolution and the evolution of bipedalism was the subject of Bigfoot, because I had spent my grade school years in Spokane, Washington. And it just happened, talking about alignment again, just happened that was one of the first cities that Patterson traveled to show his documentary footage that showcased that
Oh,
60
the
seconds of film
the
that you,
original film.
yeah.
Okay.
And so I was at the time in fifth grade, about 11 years old, and had never heard of Bigfoot prior to this occasion, but the kids were all abuzz about this film that was coming to town, and there had been an advertisement in the paper, apparently. And someone had seen, apparently there had been a reprint in Reader's Digest by now of the one of the publications that featured the Patterson Gimlin film. I think it was a Reader's Digest version of the Argosy article that
Okay.
was quite widespread and popularized the subject matter. Anyway, I remember buzzing home and getting the paper out and finding the advertisement, which I have someone actually sent me a copy after having told this story a number of times. Suddenly, someone mailed me a photocopy of the very advertisement from the Spokesman Review, the
That is pretty
newspaper.
neat.
It was really cool. So I mean,
Yeah.
that was a significant artifact for me, but it's up on the wall.
Yeah. That's
Um,
pretty impressive that you've got that and it's hanging on your
yeah,
office wall where you
that's right.
researched this.
That's right. And so anyway, obviously there was a huge impact on me and really focused a lot of attention. I became quite obsessed with learning more about this mystery, because I was also fascinated by all things mysterious. I mean, at one time we were gonna learn to fly an airplane and fly north so we could go into the hollow earth to explore this unexplored, this vast
There
area
you go.
inside the
Yeah.
planet, and things like that. I was fascinated by the writings of Ivan Sanderson. His book In Search of the Unexplained was on our bookshelf in grade school, and I remember reading that over and over again. It's just fascinated by his adventures in that respect. I was interested in the Yeti, especially learning about Bigfoot. There wasn't a lot of literature about Bigfoot at that time. But there were references, obviously, to the abominable snowman, to the Yeti,
Hmm.
and all these different mountaineers' um, memoirs and chronicles of their adventures and encounters with footprints and so forth, and the folklore surrounding the Yeti. So that was another line of exploration. Got a hold of Ivan Sanderson's book, devoured it. It was an encyclopedic treatment of not only Sasquatch, but other relic hominoids. He didn't use that term. He used a term, an acronym ABSM for short for abominable snowmen, as a generic label for
Wow.
those creatures.
Yeah.
And I loved maps, and so Sanderson illustrated his discussions of biogeographical regions and ecogeographical regions, and I learned the names of mountain ranges and countries and habitats and so forth that way. Excuse me.
Sure.
But anyway, that interest waxed and waned over the years, and it was, I must admit, quite latent as I. Although it certainly must have had some impact, some focusing
Certainly.
influence on my interests. But it wasn't until sometime later when I became I was presented with an opportunity to investigate a piece of video footage that alleged to depict a Bigfoot and filmed in Northern California, videotaped more
Hmm.
precisely in Northern California back in what was it, 90, about 95. And uh, that pulled me in,
That
that pulled
hooked
me
you.
in. I was it was an interest. I thought it'd be an interesting exercise to point out the zipper. Now I was an accomplished anatomist,
Hmm.
comparative morphologist, and so let's take a look at it. And I knew a lot about the way humans and non-human primates walked, moved, and including walked on two legs, and I couldn't find the zipper, so to speak. And and this really intrigued me. I thought, maybe there is something to this. And I started thinking more about it. And I was talking to my younger brother, who had also gone to the showing with me and my dad, the three of us.
Uh-huh.
And I was home in Boise for a visit from Pocatello, and Dr. Grover Krantz taught at Washington State University, which is only about 5 hours away, and the wives were off shopping and doing what wives do on long weekends and
Yep.
when their husbands are busy watching football or whatever. And I said to my brother, I was telling him stories about having gone down to California and investigated this videotape and yada yada yada. I said, we should go see Dr. Krantz. I've always wanted to go visit him in his lab, so why don't we just make a road trip? You and I will drive up there overnight and pay him a visit. We did, and it was fascinating. And he was very gracious and accommodating of our interest and request as to examine his collection of footprint casts. And I had by now read his book, Big Footprints, which has now been reissued as Bigfoot Sasquatch Evidence, I think is the title of the.
Okay.
But it was fascinating to see all these footprint casts firsthand. And there's just something about hefting a cast in your hands as opposed to seeing it in an illustration in a book. And
Do you think that's where your vast interest kind of
yeah,
originated?
Well, yes,
Well,
I
other
think
than your
it
childhood, but
exactly.
in
But I
your
mean,
adult
it
lives.
was yeah, no, it was focusing. It was
Yeah.
focusing. And then what happened next, though, was what set the hook. And that was we stayed the night there, and then on the way back, there was an interesting twist because having come back upon returning from our investigation of the site where this video encounter was captured, I
Hmm.
had done all sorts of research and investigation of that. The person who had invited me, Richard Greenwell, was impressed. We worked together well, but was impressed by my homework, my research, my preparation for this trip. And also on the way back, he pulls out of his briefcase a copy of a little booklet called Bigfoot of the Blues, referring to the Blue Mountains of southeastern Washington, and asked me if I might consider writing a book review. Greenwell, in addition to running the International Cryptozoology Society, was also the editor of that society's journal, the Journal of Cryptozoology.
Hmm.
And so I thought, oh yeah, this would be interesting, and it's kind of close to home there in southeastern Washington and Walla Walla area, and so I had read this, and that was another reason for going up in that direction to see Dr. Krantz, because a lot of the things that he had talked about a lot of the casts he had described and analyzed in his book had originated from the Walla Walla area because of the proximity
Oh,
of Pullman to Walla Walla. And so this gave some context, some background to these somewhat isolated footprint casts. And
sure.
so I thought, as we left Grover, I thought, let's make a detour. Let's do one more thing. Let's make a detour a little to the west and go through Walla Walla and pay a surprise visit to a couple of these people that are featured in the narratives of this book, namely Paul Freeman and Wes Summerlin. So did had a nice visit with Wes. Saw Wes as a colorful character with a interesting background, raised on the reservation. He's he has tribal connections and worked as an outfitter for years and
Hmm.
years and years, taking pack trips, hunting and fishing pack trips up into the mountains and
Yeah.
back into the wilderness of the Wanaha Tucanon region, and had many, many encounters and footprint finds associated with this topic. And so we talked to him and so forth. And then leaving him, we went over and showed up on Paul Freeman's doorstep. And
So, did you just drop in?
yes, in both
Wow.
instances, it was just a cold call.
Yeah.
So, they had no way of knowing that we were coming. Uh,
Hmm.
it was a last minute decision. We were, otherwise we would have gone home by a different route. And at the last minute decided to detour a little bit out of our way to go over to Walla Walla and showed up on Paul Freeman's porch. He was just himself driving up. Turns out, after showing us his footprint casts, and there's something about the originals too that
Hmm.
just isn't quite captured by the replicas. I don't know what I mean. I mean, the replicas have the shape, but there's just something about the originals. I don't know what it is. It's almost as if they've captured a little bit of, the
Yeah.
spirit of the thing, the
Right.
animation of the thing.
That would
But
make sense.
yeah, I mean, it's just a subjective impression, I'm sure, but it's interesting. I mean, it made a huge impression to actually see these things. And again, like I said, hefting them myself and looking at them and being able to rotate them in the light, examine the details and even see skin details, skin ridge pattern and so forth on some of these that Grover had drawn attention to himself. Anyway, I was plying Paul with questions, and he he said, "Well, you obviously know a lot about footprints. Would you like to see some fresh footprints?" And I just like,
Mm.
what? And my brother
Oh.
looks at me. I look at my brother and I go, what do you mean? He said, well, I just found some this morning. That's where I was coming back from when you showed up on my doorstep. As soon as the snows have melted back and I have some free time, I drive these roads and, they're just dirt roads. And most of them have no gravel improvements. They make great tracking beds if you can drive on them, if they're
Hmm.
not too wet, or still have snow banks. Anyway, to make a long story short, because I don't want to this,
Oh
he
no,
had found, he had
please.
found tracks. He had found tracks, and so he took us up and showed us these tracks. And I'm just flabbergasted. I'm sitting here kind of pinching myself. Here were these 14-inch tracks that were clear as a bell. I mean, he kept saying how they weren't perfect, they weren't clear as a bell. They were, he said, I wouldn't even bother making casts of these unless they're perfect, he said, because he had such a extensive collection now over the past 10 years.
Hmm.
And I'm sitting here thinking to myself, well, what he thinks are imperfections are actually the signs of the spontaneity and animation that you would expect in a real living trackway, as opposed to, a set of imprints made with crude stompers strapped or screwed.
Sure. Yeah, I guess to the untrained or educated in that field,
Yeah,
that's the way it would seem.
yeah. Well, he had just elevated his standard for justifying going to the effort so high. He was a good tracker, and he didn't. There were instances where he would show me a footprint cast, and he would be kind of coy about it, like say, well, I'm not sure about this one. Sometimes he would get notification of the presence of tracks by somebody else. He'd go up and investigate, and he'd make a plaster cast, and they were obviously hoaxed. Someone was
Mm.
just pranking him because of the notoriety that he had gained from a couple of appearances on television and newscasts and so forth due to his finds and his videos. And he knew that they were hoaxed, and I think he was just testing me by being a little bit coy about it. And once I had his confidence, then he was very forthcoming about details and so on. But in any case, but these had, it's kind of like when Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin were making footprint casts in the wake of their encounter in their film. Roger looked for the cleanest, clearest, flattest examples that he could find that, to his eye, best captured the shape of the foot. But a footprint is not a mold of a foot. It is the footprint is a record of the step. It's a very dynamic process, not just a duplication of an object,
Hmm.
rather the record of an action. And so the footprint cast um, has introduced into it a living footprint cast, has things like comet tails and drag outs and slippage of the toes flex, and the foot bends and causes pressure ridges and tension cracks and compression features and so forth. And so I'm looking at this and seeing all that these are real footprints, and I'm kind of
Yeah,
figuratively pinching myself saying,
I would imagine.
yeah, my gosh, how did this happen? This he couldn't have done this. I mean, because I was pointing out details and things that I was seeing that features that when I described them to him, you could tell he was nodding politely. But I mean, I'm an instructor. When a student
Right,
doesn't get it, you know that they don't get it, and
right.
and so there were details there that he had no idea of their interpretation or their significance. Um, and there were very few people who would. Uh,
Hmm.
and so Yeah, no, it was quite the. I've compared it to that popular M&M's Christmas season commercial where the M&Ms come walking in and surprise Santa at the Christmas tree, and they both go, "He does exist. We do exist," and then they both pass out and faint.
Yeah.
Well, it was
Yeah.
kind of like that realization of it does exist, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, for me, this was extremely compelling evidence, and might be lost on some people. It might not have that same impact, and that's why when I'm asked what what convinces you, what do you hold as the best evidence? Well, it's the footprint evidence. It's by far the most pervasive. It's the most consistent. It has been consistent over 60 years. And since we've been keeping track since the first cast was poured in 1958, that we know of,
Uh-huh.
and so on. Uh, but more than that, it reveals anatomical features which actually in 1958 were counterintuitive to the notions about the pattern and timing of the evolution of human bipedalism. And yet now, 60 years later, uh, it's absolutely consistent with what is conventional wisdom in anthropology as far as the biomechanics, the model of a large bipedal primitive lacking a longitudinal arch, flat, flexible foot of
Mm-hmm.
a hominoid biped. That's remarkably impressive. But to see tracks that are so fresh that when I knelt down next to them, you could still see skin ridge detail, the dermatoglyphics, the friction skin on the sole of the foot in places on the tracks, because the substrate there in the blues outside of Walla Walla, as is the case across much of southern Idaho, has a very high loess content. Loess is also sometimes called glacial flour, Flour. So it's a
Okay.
fine talcum powdery consistency that is so fine that it picks up small details on the surface of the contact surface of the foot, including skin ridge details. And so even in some cases, you can see the little sweat pores are are transferred to
Really?
the substrate. Yeah, and on rare occasions, they're picked up by the plaster pore if it's the right consistency, not too thick, not too thin, especially if any care has been taken to consolidate the substrate, or if it's very moist, clayey as opposed to dry and powdery. Um, it those details can and we've confirmed that through experimentation in the laboratory, reproducing the conditions with soils collected under those from those regions,
Mm-hmm.
and even here. I mean, yeah.
Are
So
are
that
those, I'm sorry, go ahead.
yeah, no, that's fine.
Are those when those types of tracks are found with dermal ridges or what you've just described, are those when a cast is made and they're then taken, is there a way to analyze or compare those to known primates, or
Yeah.
is there a way to pursue determining what left that print?
Yes. Well, first, very general terms, the presence of friction skin of this appearance, this nature, attests to this being a large primate. Their primates on their palms and soles have this kind of skin. There are a few other arboreal or tree climbing mammals, some of the marsupials, that
Hmm.
also have coarse or have some development of ridge skin, but not to the extent and to the delicacy and fine texture of the living primates. And but having said that, the examples that we have number only, between a half dozen to a dozen, and only in limited um, regions of the sole of the foot,
Hmm.
because when they're transferred, it requires, first of all, it requires that there be good definition of the dermatoglyphic. Sometimes individuals build up quite thick calluses, and there can be abrasion of the surface that lessens the topography and therefore lessens the transfer of detail. You must have a substrate that's fine enough in its particulate size, of a scale that will pick up those details on the sole of the foot. It has to be discovered within a period of time of duration, persistence of that feature, because gravity will literally pull it out. Moisture will pull it
Mm.
out, and flatten out those features. We did an experiment where I took a step. I prepared some of the very silty soil out in my garden. Uh, that, like I said, here in southeastern Idaho, we have lots and lots of lust deposits, and very mineral rich, but very low in organics. So to get your garden going, you have to add a lot of peat and a lot of manure and a lot of other organic material to
Hmm.
get the texture of soil. But out on any road, you can just go out, or any hillside. If you clear across or clear the biofilm, oftentimes then underneath is just that pulverized. It's just like breaking open a sack of flour.
Sure.
So I had prepared a track bed in my garden. I made a print in it was under moist conditions, kind of overcast, drizzly conditions, quite similar to the conditions experienced at the site when I was examining these footprints. I made it a footprint and then, washed off my foot, any adhering mud or whatever. So nice and clean and lots of relief. And then waited, um, uh, and made another, and so on, repeating that down the row. And then, so there was a span of about, 6 hours, and then made a cast of the first one and the second one and so forth on down. But the first one by now was 6 hours old, and
Hmm.
then one that was brand new and fresh. And boy, when you compared those two together over 6 hours, the vast majority, I'd say 80% of the features were gone, just pulled out,
Really?
and nothing else had happened. There was no rain. There was, I mean, it doesn't, wind has no effect on when it's clay like this.
Hmm.
And, but it was just the effects of gravity and the humidity of the air. So my point is this: you have to have good dermatoglyphic features on the foot. You have to have a substrate that's a fine enough particulate matter that it will take and hold for some time, that feature, those features. You have to have it persist until the footprint is discovered, and
Hmm.
that's usually not instantaneous.
Right.
And then you have to have someone who has enough experience and skill in preparing the plaster and all, that it's a good consistency, that it's not going to obliterate the features, and that the plaster is fine enough that it will pick up, whether it's plaster of Paris or dental stone or even gypsum cement, or fix it all. Um, uh, what did I say? Gypsum cement is the same as hydric cal. That was Florida. So plaster or hydrocal or fix-it-all, which is a patching compound, but still has sufficient fine texture that it will pick up that detail. I was going to say that most of the casts that were done by Paul Freeman, he used fix-it-all, and
Okay.
his he the the majority of the examples of dramatic glyphics are from Paul Freeman's casts. So anyway, the point being is it is rare to have all those things line up and um, be present and in effect is a rare set of circumstances. So there aren't very many examples of dermatoglyphics. It's not like, and even if we have a repeat appearance of a known individual who's recognizable based on the morphology, the size, the breadth, the configuration of the toes, um, um, if there are uh, dermatoglyphics on multiple examples from that individual. Rarely, in fact, there's never been a good example of a repeat of exactly the same spot to say, oh yes, look how they'd match. Therefore, this
Hmm.
is the same individual on the basis of footprints. Now, on the basis of morphology, I'm quite comfortable in saying yes, this and this and this. I mean, we're in a given geographical area. That was, in fact, one of the questions that I asked very early on. If these creatures exist, they must be very rare given the infrequency of encounters and reports and so forth. If they are remarkably rare, but evidence is being found repeatedly in a given constrained geographical region, then the odds are those evidences, those footprints, are from a few individuals, and it stands to reason there should be repeat appearances of those individuals.
That would make sense.
Yeah. And so I started looking for recognizable examples that had that presented features that could be pointed to, whether it was, a distinctive shape of the big toe, or if it was, any number of things. Mostly just the general appearance, just defined by the breadth and length, um, and so on. But
So your thought is clearly that the best evidence available at this point is these prints.
I do, I do think
And
so.
and and that makes sense, and especially talking about the ridges and how quickly they I guess you would call deteriorate, like you said, through gravity
Right.
and
Right.
whatnot. But is there also, in the same vein as the tracks or the prints, is there also, again, I'm not a scientist. I'm nowhere near educated in this type of thing, but the breaks, the mid-tarsal breaks of the
Hmm.
foot, what could you discuss about that
Sure.
in
Yeah.
association with these tracks?
Absolutely. So it's nothing mysterious or anomalous or unconventional. Basically, what it is, it has its roots in the fundamental adaptation for locomotion found in the non-human great apes, the tailless primates, which are characterized, with the exception of extreme examples like the orangutan, where the foot has largely been reduced to a hook with just a
Hmm.
nubbin of a big toe. They've lost the distal phalanx and usually don't have a nail. It's just a little stump, because that gives a little brace on this side, but most of the locomotion just involves these long curved digits. I mean, permanently curved. The bones are curved. So
Okay,
even passively, I mean, they cannot straighten out their fingers like that.
that's just the way they are.
Yeah. And so they can passively just hook onto a branch, and it doesn't even really take any muscle effort. The passive tension in the muscles and the tendons just hold that hook from opening anymore.
Hmm.
Anyway, so that's an extreme case, but basically the adaptation is what we call a grasp climbing adaptation. Monkeys, old world monkeys, run around on the most of them run on the tops of the branches. They're basically they did evolve up in the trees, but they then spent a lot of time, most of them, with varying degrees of terrestriality. And so they are little runners. They've got narrow chests, like your pet dog, right? With shoulder blades on the sides,
Hmm.
instead of having this great ape adaptation that we share. That's why we look like a chimpanzee, much more than, say, a baboon, is that we have this flattened chest with shoulder blades on the back of the rib cage, and then which allows a much greater range of motion at the shoulder. We can circumscribe a hemispheric range of motion, whereas the baboons are mostly doing this. It's like
Okay.
when you were a kid, when you'd pick up your dog, not pick him up, but when he would jump up and you'd hold his front paws and try to
Yeah.
dance with him,
Yeah.
you can't spread his legs out this way.
Right.
It's because they just, anyway.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah.
So, so the foot, that vertical climbing adaptation, the foot evolved a very robust big toe that opposed in a gripping fashion the lateral digits, which are long and curved, even in a gorilla and a chimp. Less so in a gorilla, more so in a chimp, even more so in orangutan. Um, Now, when you're climbing up a tree, then you actually need two functions. You need this grasping prehensile function of the forefoot, but then you still need a lever, right, to push
Hmm.
the center of mass upward. And so to have that, a degree of independence of function, grasping or prehension here and propulsion back here, you need a much more mobile midfoot. And so all primates have a much greater range of motion. The stiff arch of the human foot is a rather distinctive characteristic and a fairly recent innovation. In fact, it's not uncommon for upwards of 20 to 30% of the human population to have asymptomatic, flat, flexible feet.
Hmm.
Okay, they don't have a good healthy arch. And you can see that when you watch people get out of the swimming pool in the summer, walk across the cement. There's various degrees of, very distinctive hourglass shape. In some instances, the arch is so high, there's a patch of cement that doesn't have any moisture on it at all. And then
Right.
there are those that are very flat, some that are even rotated inward, pronated, so that the medial side, the inside of the foot, is bulging inward instead of raised up off the ground. The fact that there's that range of variation suggests that this is an adaptation that has only recently become fixed and selected for strongly in the human population. Sasquatch never has evolved an arch. It's would be counter productive because of their massive body size. You always have to remember that volume, and therefore the mass and weight, is increasing to the cube of the linear dimensions, breadth, height, and width, or depth, I
Yep.
guess you'd say. Depth, breadth, and height. Whereas the surface area on the foot is the square of the linear dimensions. As the foot gets longer and wider, that surface area is not, the proportion of surface area to body mass is not keeping up. So
Okay.
you can't just increase the size of the human foot. You need to change it. See, so like a pituitary giant, human giant, it doesn't change the shape of the body that much. Their feet, therefore, don't work well. They tend to flatten the arches and pronate the feet. Their ankles are weak. Their knees give them problems as a result. And then obviously it works its way on up to the hips and the lower back. And of course, then they often have other problems because their organ system is not designed for that dimension. Sasquatch has been selected. It is designed for that dimension. It's why it looks different. It doesn't just look
Hmm.
like a man in a fursuit. It looks like
Right.
something very different. But the foot is excessively broad for its length by comparison to humans, but it has avoided evolving an arch, see, which puts pressure under 2 points of contact, the ball of the foot and the heel. But a Sasquatch foot being flattened distributes weight better over a much larger surface that's
Hmm.
in contact. It doesn't quite keep up though, so something else is needed. Well, they discovered that if a human walks with what they have called a Groucho walk, an homage to Groucho Marx and his famous,
Kind of
you
the
know,
hunch.
yeah,
Yeah.
with bent knees and hips, and so he just moves. He doesn't bounce when he walks. He just moves horizontally across the stage. Well, if we walk like that as humans, we reduce the ground, what they call ground reaction force, which is the opposing force to the compressive force. It's kind of weird how physicists describe it that way, but the ground is pushing back, so it's called the ground reaction force. Um, we can reduce that force by up to like 20% by walking with a Groucho walk. So
Hmm.
that's the other way. Isn't it interesting that people who see Sasquatch strolling down the forest path, he's not bouncing along like a human walking on pole vaulted legs up, maximizing our step length and our extended knee. Instead, they've described it as it was like it was gliding. It was like it was floating through the air. It was like it was riding a bicycle because the
Hmm.
head wasn't going up and down. It was just moving horizontally across the landscape. Well, that walking like that helps to reduce those ground reaction forces. You've probably done it yourself if you've ever gone backpacking or you're carrying a heavy load, from the truck into the garage. You walk with more flexed limbs, especially like if you're walking downhill with a heavy backpack on,
Hmm.
in order to reduce those. So anyway, so it's all correlated. So back to your original question, the
Yeah.
mid-tarsal break. So having avoided the evolution of the arch, maintaining that flat, flexible foot form, even when on the ground, it serves them well when they're going up steep inclines because now you don't need a divergent big toe to grasp. So the toe is aligned, but those long toes, still relatively long toes, are great for prehension on steep, rugged, irregular surfaces. But you now can still use prehension and then the movement back here of the heel segment. It's like if you think again about the sort of an example of application. If you go off trail and you're going up a steep slope with stiff hiking boots on, you end up kind of walking like a mountaineer with crampons going up an ice sheet. You stick
Right.
in your toes or you turn and walk sideways so that because you're not able to bend your foot, not only because of the arch, but you've entombed it within the old-fashioned stiff walking shoes.
Right.
And so the Sasquatch foot is greatly is an elegant adaptation for this creature to walk up and down to navigate these steep, very irregular, broken surfaces. So
Hmm.
it retains that. Now the break, when we say break, we mean to flex. you know,
Okay.
to change the direction. Like if a receiver's, he runs out and breaks right, he cuts right. It's an axis of flexion, not a damaging action.
Okay.
So the break occurs, and the term mid-tarsal break was actually coined to describe the kinematics of the chimpanzee foot when it walks on the ground because that flexibility is expressed in the axis of flexion across the midfoot, what would be our instep, except our instep is raised up, because of the arch. And those
Hmm.
joints twist and lock into a stable position. So the whole foot acts like a lever, see, instead of
Okay.
being flexed and breaking across the transverse tarsal joint. As a result of that shorter leverage, because of that break point, which then dictates that that's the fulcrum of the lever, how do we increase leverage? We increase the length of the heel segment. And so the
Mm.
Sasquatch has a disproportionate heel projection. And now here's an interesting point again. It's just fascinating to me how all these little things tie together. You think you're having
Certainly.
a conversation over here, and then over here, here's an example. So when you look at the Patterson-Gimlin film, one of the things that the critics have criticized is that when she's walking, there is clearly an artificial heel that's projecting beyond where the Achilles tendon is attached, which makes no sense. So unless you had an actor standing on a false foot that projects further than their own heel, projects further posteriorly. Well, what is actually going on is, given the elongated heel, and we can show examples of this in the great apes, we can show it in the early hominins before the human arch actually became fixed. Um, if the heel is projected further back, the distance between the Achilles tendon and the shin bone, the tibia, is greater. And when that muscle, that Achilles tendon is slack, when the muscle is not tensed, then that long tendon isn't describing a straight line, it's kind of curved.
Mm.
It's slack, and it makes the heel look like it's projected. See, now if this was a sincere, genuine criticism, they would demonstrate on more than one picture frame, but you go to the other frames when the muscle is contracting and tension is now on that tendon and it's taut, and guess what? It strikes an absolute straight line from the most proximal point on the heel bone up to the calf musculature. The
Mm.
protruding heel disappears
Huh.
mysteriously, see?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so they always draw attention to that one picture and ignore all the rest of the film footage, which shows the figure walking with an absolutely normal looking ankle and heel and Achilles tendon or calcaneal tendon.
Right. Well,
But that,
you
yeah.
no, go
No, I
ahead.
was
I'm
just gonna say
sorry.
that. I was just gonna say that, but that attests to this strategy of lengthening the heel segment and why it looks different on this creature than the human.
That makes complete sense. In this film, the Patterson Gimlin film was something that I really wanted to talk about for a couple different reasons. One, to discuss the generalization of does Bigfoot Sasquatch exist? But two, to kind of go into the direction of what we're going to talk about here shortly about if Sasquatch were shown to, for whatever reason, to be human or a
Hmm.
subspecies of human or some sort of link, um, how would that affect laws and legal issues? And so the film is so fascinating, and I think we could probably talk about that one thing for hours upon hours.
Oh
And I
yeah,
certainly don't want to take your time
sure.
doing that, but I do want to ask you a couple things about the film specifically. As an expert in your field, when you look at that film, what about that film, what direction does that push you in,
Oh yeah,
belief wise?
yeah,
That's the question.
yeah. Well, I'm excuse me, I'm absolutely convinced of the veracity of that film on the basis of the evidence that and the analysis that we've conducted on many aspects of the the film, the figure, the footprints. If I had just the footprints that have been documented from the film site to go on, I would be convinced in the credibility, the authenticity of the film. But having the footprint, very, very well documented footprint evidence, and we're talking a minimum of 12, a dozen, and even more that have surfaced where other people have come forward after having made casts at the site early on.
And you're talking during that time period of when that film was made and before and after, right? When we're
Well,
talking about
sure,
gathering
yeah.
prints,
I
tracks,
mean,
yeah.
the ones specifically associated with the film site and incident were the two casts made by Roger Patterson, the right and the left. And as I mentioned earlier, he was looking for the cleanest, clearest copies that,
Hmm.
examples rather, that he could find. But then another investigator, Bob Titmus, came to the site about 10 days later to investigate after having heard the stories and seen the film, and he had enough plaster, which he used very judiciously and made 10 casts in succession, regardless
Hmm.
of the quality of the footprint.
Hmm.
And that proved to be a remarkable record of the variation and diversity, and included one of the footprints that has a very marked expression of the mid-tarsal pressure ridge, and is played very centrally in the description and diagnosis of the footprints themselves. Um, but to have those and to be able to see the track maker and see the correlated kinematics, the description of the or depiction, let's say, of the
Hmm.
walk of the steps that produce those footprints. Like our description, my discussion of the mid-tarsal break, and to explain this very distinctive pressure ridge that's present in a number of the casts from the film site. I'm absolutely confident in that interpretation. It's not a hypothesis. It is a bona fide interpretation that is confirmed by watching the track maker do the very thing that the footprint indicates. That is the heel coming up independently. Well, I mean, initially and somewhat independently of the forefoot, and that pressure concentrated under the forefoot, causing the failure of the substrate, pushing up a pressure ridge, and then the push off from the forefoot, producing now a deeper imprint because of more mass and impulse concentrated through half the area now. So that's the deepest imprint. And then, off through the toes, but the toes not providing real differential propulsion, but mainly there is traction to keep the
Hmm.
further slipping back of the foot on the substrate. I mean, there's no question. There's no room.
Right.
You have to accept that what you see on the film, regardless of what you think that is, was responsible for making the tracks that were documented at the scene, as attested to by multiple witnesses.
Sure.
So it's
It,
just, yeah.
and I see, and I think there's a combination of additional effects as well, like the musculature of that
Yeah,
movement of that whatever it was as it strolled along, the
right.
limb proportions, the
Yeah,
female anatomy,
yeah,
just the that gait, all of that, like you said, combined with what you're looking at, in
right.
addition to what prints it left. So
Yeah,
I was just curious what your opinion is on that. And I think this would
yeah,
be maybe a segue into what I'm really interested in talking about is in the event that whatever that was striding across there in that film, if like we said, if that were shown to be human or subspecies thereof, would laws apply to that? This episode of the Right to Remain Silent True Crime Podcast is sponsored by Graphic Options. When it comes to custom screen printing, embroidery, and promotional gear, Brenda and her team are the real deal. I trust them with everything, whether it's a hat for my consulting business, a shirt for my podcast, or a large order of both. They've never let me down. They don't treat you like just another order. They listen, they care, and they make sure you walk away with something you're proud to put your name on. You have the right to great service and quality, and that's exactly what you'll get at Graphic Options. Visit graphicoptionsonline.com. That's graphicoptionsonline.com, and let them know the Right to Remain Silent podcast sent you. And it brings a myriad of legal type of questions. And in this film situation, several of them pop into to my mind being those prints that were made, that film that was taken, should there have been or should there be now a department or an agency, a law enforcement department or federal agency of some sort be designated to maybe not seize, but to process that original film, package it as evidence, create a official report of some sort, and to test in whatever manner available to test that film, and to actually store that film. The tracks, should we have trained experts in the law enforcement field that do that for a living? For instance, CSI, crime scene investigator type of people. I mean, should there be an element of that to where these prints are, like you said earlier, is the mixture proper? Was the cast made correctly? Should law enforcement be involved to do something like that? Is kind of what I'm in a roundabout way trying to say, specific to that filming incident right there.
Right.
What are your thoughts on something
Yeah.
like that?
Well, a bunch of questions there. So let's see. First of all, first of all, the original film does not exist.
That was my understanding.
Yeah. The original film, it through, sort of less than responsible lending of the film to documentarians and so forth, and then company going bankrupt and
Hmm.
assets being seized, and there's a long convoluted story.
Sure.
It's a mystery in and of itself. So we have multiple copies, multiple generational copies of copies, and so on. And we've
Hmm.
done some really interesting analysis. There's an episode of the Proof is Out There documentary show that is by far the best and up-to-date discussion of the analysis that has been based on a optimization process to composite those copies in order to lessen the effects of grain artifact from
Hmm.
copying. Not We're not copying pixels, but we're copying from film to film with photographic grains, and so these irregular shaped grains that differ with each emulsion, each film stock introduce edge features and so on, and blurriness and so on. Um, and that can be looked up. That's available online if you just Google
Okay.
my name or Bill Munn's Isaac T, and so that's one aspect to bear in mind. So there isn't anything to archive or to log, and so but this also indicates that there are analyses that are being done.
Hmm.
The best things that can be done to date are being undertaken. Um, the Now another point, your to your question of the humanity, if we are limiting the label of human to members of the species Homo sapiens, then obviously that is a clear indication that these are not humans. Are they anything close to human? Um, Even members of the genus Homo, and which casts the net much more broadly. In fact, too broadly. There are members, there are species included, in my opinion, that have no business being in the genus Homo. Some of the early forms like Homo habilis, um, Homo rudolfensis, and so forth, which are just forms, slightly more advanced forms of Australopithecines. But there's a distinctive grade jump when you go to Homo ergaster and Homo erectus, and
Okay.
then and that grade jump, differences in body size, differences in sexual dimorphism, a major jump in cranial capacity from barely bigger than a chimpanzee to halfway between a chimp and us, major differences. And that's reflected also in the material culture. One of the defining characteristics of human is of the Homo grade is complex and consistent material culture, a toolkit of stone tools and other materials, that may not have preserved as well, like bone and stone and or bone and wood and so forth. Um, if you take a close-up of the creature on that film, and if we
Hmm.
can accept for a moment that that is a good photographic record of a representative of this species, you put it up alongside a cranium of something like a robust Australopithecine, an early bipedal hominin that predates or precedes, well, was actually contemporaneous to, for quite some time, Homo ergaster in Africa, but essentially is a bipedal chimp. We might just say its brain is only about 50%, I'm sorry, not 50%, 10% bigger, only about 50 cc's bigger. So about 550 cc's, whereas human, 1500 to 1600 cc's um, in volume, if that's a
Hmm.
reasonable measure of intelligence and
Sure.
capacity and so forth. When you see that film, you don't see any of the accoutrements that we associate with Homo. There's no stuff like the stuff of material culture. There's no evidence of fire control, of home bases, of clothing, tool manufacture, portable objects, resource
Sure.
transport. Instead, what you see is this hairy biped, essentially, like I said, a bipedal chimp or gorilla. And so I think that it's, that any notion, the idea that these are forest people, that they
Hmm.
are somehow primitive people, primitive humans of some type or variety, I think is just gone way off the
Okay.
rails. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
no,
Yeah.
no disrespect intended.
Oh,
A lot of
no, not
people
at
hold that
all.
opinion, but
Right.
I don't think there's any justification for that opinion. Now, whether how that impacts the question of rights or treatment, I mean, hopefully we're treating all animals ethically and morally,
Correct.
you
Right.
know,
Right.
but this stuff of what is the rank, what is the regard that we owe anthropomorphic creatures that resemble us. That's been the stuff of all. And I can look across here, and I can see two or three paperback novels of which the plot centers on that very question.
Wow. Well,
Where,
and
yeah,
no, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was going to say, like there's one where a primitive tribe is discovered in Africa that appears. I mean, eventually it's recognized that it's a form of relic hominoid, a hominin species that has persisted and may be capable of crossbreeding with humans, cross
Right.
fertilization.
Right.
And
Right.
so the whole book is about just exploring the rights that these creatures have and how they can avoid exploiting this population as
Right,
they
right.
go on.
And maybe I should have phrased it this way before I posed the question, is it's a hypothetical,
Yeah,
question based off of just different conversations that I've had with people or watched on a documentary
sure.
or read in an
Yeah.
article.
Oh,
And
sure.
I've read and watched about indigenous people and the Native Americans and
Hmm.
how they've referenced it in their culture as a hairy man or a wild man or
Yeah,
something along those lines. And if that were ever shown to be legitimate or proven, that's why that's the
right.
basis that I've posed these questions because I have a very good friend that is a prosecutor for the state here in Missouri. And I posed this question to him,
Yeah,
theoretically, if a hunter saw this creature and, shot and killed it, and it were shown to be a human, is that homicide? Or,
right.
if this creature were shot and killed and it's just shown to be an animal, ape-like, again, I would use the analogy of you can't just walk around shooting dogs and killing pets, and there's legal repercussions there. So I would think on the second one, if it were chimp-like or something along those lines, there would be that type of legal ramifications. But in my conversations with him, hey, if this were ever proven to be a person and a hunter killed it, could there be legal, ramifications for that? And what his response to me was, he actually read the definition of the law of homicide,
Hmm.
and it is a person commits the offense of homicide or murder if he or she knowingly causes the death of another person.
Right.
So there we go. So that would
Yeah.
address that. But I was curious about that. And talking about the Patterson Gimlin film, one of the things is my thought was this. If that film, no, the original no longer existed, but there continues to be research, there continues to be video, there continues to be photographs. Should at some point now in the present time, should I don't know. These are hypothetical questions that have been posed to me over the years, and I've thought about myself as well. Should there be an agency
Yeah.
that seizes and holds this? And I wasn't saying that proper testing isn't done now or in the past, but should there be an official mechanism or component where all testing is done through XYZ crime lab or
Hmm.
packaged and seized as evidence and held at this crime lab? And I'm looking at it from the perspective of as a law enforcement officer for 30 years, part of my responsibilities was packaging and transporting and testing evidence. Would that be beneficial in the overall, in the grand scheme of things
Yeah.
in this, or is that just too, by the nature of, nationwide, worldwide, is that just too complicated to even consider?
Well, I don't think necessarily complicated. And there would be certainly advantages to have advantages in having consistent protocols applied to evidence repeatedly instead of a number of isolated reports or instances from various entities that
Mm,
may not be comparable or may not be equally reliable.
right.
Certainly, that would be an advantage. My question would then be what where would a source of such reliability be found? And so far, most government agencies have not have not.
Volunteered. They're not knocking down the door to do this.
Well, I wasn't even going that direction. But that is a critical aspect as well, because there's such a stigma attached.
Hmm.
But I mean, there've been instances where There was a recent flap of publicity over a Freedom of Information Act release where hair samples had been submitted to the FBI. They had been examined and identified and as deer. And I was extremely surprised that they even got tested and it didn't get because they were submitted as potential Bigfoot hair samples. So the
Hmm.
fact that they even examined them, I thought was quite
That's a substantial
commendable.
step. Yeah.
Yeah, but it was very unfortunate that the person involved submitted a deer hair sample, which, and I haven't seen the sample itself, but if it was a deer guard hair, you can hold a deer hair up to the light, pretty much tell, given its coarseness and rigidity. And when you put it under a light microscope, it has such a distinctive medullary pattern of this vesiculated, this kind of, it looks like froth down the center, lots
Hmm.
of little bubbles. And it's a substantial medulla, which gives the hair its stiffness there. But unfortunately, it feeds the rumor mill or the conclusion by the skeptics that any time a hair sample is actually examined by a bona fide lab, in this case an FBI lab, it turns out to be some common form of wildlife or whatever. And so it did a real disservice. I mean,
Yeah.
I can send I could send hair samples that are not readily attributable to any other common wildlife out there. The only thing they might be mistaken for is human hair, but there are
Hmm.
distinguishing characteristics that would make that probability much less, like the lack of a cellular medulla, for example. So instead of that frothy center or a nice solid band of, or even interrupted, sometimes the humans have present what's called an interrupted medulla where it's discontinuous or interrupted.
Hmm.
But in any case, there are ways to distinguish, but uh, those never get publicized. They never get published.
Right.
It's a sure thing to give attention to something that seems to refute this persistent wild goose
Why
chase. But
why is it
yeah.
so difficult, do you think? I mean,
Well,
there are
up until
yeah.
recently, there was no affirmation from the scientific community because it was not deemed reasonable that such a thing could even exist. The way in which the pattern and process of human evolution was perceived was a single file, an exclusive club. You know, we talked about bipedalism, we
Hmm.
talked about brain increased size and material culture. Those things have been used very broadly to define the hominin niche. And according to the principles of ecology and evolution, there can be only one species in any particular niche. And we're in it. See? We're the
Yeah.
occupant. We're the exclusive member of the club. And so there couldn't be something like a Sasquatch. It just could not exist. And
Hmm.
so therefore it doesn't, and the evidence is not reliable. It's all hoaxed. Well, now that single species hypothesis, that single species within a niche, as far as the hominin niche goes, has been thrown out the window. And we have more and more and more specimens and species identified. And instead of a single file march, we've got this bushy tree with lots of contemporaneous species coexisting across the landscape. And some of those have persisted alongside us until remarkably recently in the accepted known fossil record. Why not to the present? Why couldn't there be something like a Sasquatch scattered across North America and clear into Asia, all the way over to the Caucasus? Why couldn't there be remnant Australopithecines in Central Africa? Why couldn't there be Neanderthals in the reaches of the Mongolian highlands, where there were Neanderthals just a few tens of thousands of years ago. Why couldn't there be, things like the Hobbit in Southeast Asia, where they found the skeleton of Homo floresiensis in very recent deposits, cave deposits. So anyway, so now it's not such an outlandish proposition. It could exist. So the question is, what's the likelihood? What's the probability that these things have persisted and yet escaped our acknowledgement, our recognition after all these years? Well, it's rather egotistical and arrogant to think that we have discovered everything that remains to be discovered, and that we've cataloged every possible and species and forged every square inch of every corner of the globe. You know,
Sure.
so
Sure.
so there are those in the scientific community, but that's a recent development. Just in the
Okay.
past 25 years at most. And so prior to that, if the scientific community is not going to give it any deference, give it any serious consideration, then no other agency, no other government agency, or no other law enforcement agency, no other wildlife, fish and game departments, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, they're not, except for some, at least officially, except for some individuals who, through their personal experience or contact with other people who have had experiences, may be a little more open-minded to the possibility. And
Hmm.
I think that's beginning to change the
Kind of swing in that direction.
atmosphere. Yeah,
Sure.
yeah, yeah.
Sure.
It's a very
What?
subtle swing. It's more like a glacial crawl in that direction. But
Right. At least a bit of movement that way.
yeah, absolutely.
And I think I may have mentioned it earlier, and if not, I I'm not an individual that firmly believes in the existence of Sasquatch, but
Hmm.
I think through all these credible sightings and these tracks, and especially this Patterson Gimlin film, I don't think it's outside the realm of possibility. But
Right.
again, I refer to being a cop for 30 years, and you need to show me
Hmm.
some direct evidence. And I think a lot of people are like-minded. They're not ruling it out, but
Right.
they're not 100% on board
Well,
yet.
of
Is
course.
is there
Yeah.
anything you would say to an individual like me or to individuals like that out there?
Well, no, not well. Yes, yes, but I mean, first, I would preface by saying It's not my goal to convince you.
Sure,
It's not my.
absolutely.
It's not my goal to proselytize, if you will, and accrue adherence to my point of view. I just advocate for the evidence and for an open mind regarding that. And I mean, I would like to see, as a result of that, I mean, what I am advocating for is serious objective investigation and a
Sure,
fair hearing for my work, and those of my colleagues who have also gone out on the proverbial limb. I think
certainly.
that we're deserving of that acknowledgement. But it's interesting. I've had this conversation with other people, and the way I've turned it around is to point out, isn't it interesting that there, not to characterize your position as that of a skeptic, but for a moment turning attention to the more ideological skeptics,
Certainly.
they have their favorite piece of missing evidence that they harp on, and whether and it's justified perhaps to a degree, to at least acknowledge the shortcomings. We don't have the conclusive physical evidence. I mean, obviously, that's what's missing. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having this conversation,
Right,
talking about other
right,
things.
right.
But on the other hand, they're all too ready to dismiss offhandedly and completely all of the evidence that does exist. And there is evidence. I mean, as I pointed out in our and through our conversations, the footprint
Hmm.
evidence. We've talked at length about the Patterson-Gimlin film as a significant piece of evidence that dovetails with that footprint evidence as well. Um, that needs to be accounted for. You can't just say, well, where's the body? And yet not be willing to engage with the evidence. If you can't come up with an explanation for these footprints, and a good explanation, and a set of carved wooden stompers is not a sufficient explanation,
Right.
um, then you're not in a position to uh, to opine uh, as to the merits of the overall proposition. I mean, I think it's incumbent on anybody that's objective and honest with themselves to acknowledge that there is remarkable, let's say suggestive, if an individual doesn't find it compelling, it's at least suggestive of the
Well,
very real
certainly.
real possibility that these creatures exist. And I've talked to so many people who they just have a closed mind. I had a former chair of the department who his retort to me one time was, I born and raised in Idaho. I grew up in the state. I've hunted and fished all across it all my life, and I've never seen it. If it was out there, I'd have seen it. And yet, I've talked to other people who say something very similar. I've born and raised in Idaho. I've hunted and fished all across the state. In all the years of my travels, I've never seen anything. But you'll never believe what happened last week. It only takes one experience to turn that attitude 180 degrees. And
Yeah,
these experiences happen by serendipity. They're so rare. It's like winning the lottery. Rarely are there investigators who, like myself, who go out there and intentionally look. And in the decades that I've been doing it, what do I have to show for it? I've got, you know, about a dozen or half dozen footprint examples, some that are quite compelling. I've had collected a few hair strands. I've heard some inexplicable sounds that stand up under examination that don't match up with any known wildlife out there. But beyond that, I haven't. Well, I did catch a glimpse. But see, obviously, did it's not of a quality that it rose right to the fore in my
sure.
my description. It was a fleeting glimpse through night vision of a figure that almost, or very, let's put it this way. I was going to say almost certainly. I mean, I'm almost to the point where I can say that, but I'll say better than 50-50 chances of what I
Sure.
saw, what
Yeah,
was fleeting shadow, because it had all the characteristics that we've discussed as far as, the Groucho walk, the posture, the arm swing, the
sure.
behavior in association with 13 and a half inch footprints in the moss, having taken sample or baits previously in the previous days and so on and so on. Anyway, my point being that most encounters are purely by chance, and that and they're very rare.
Yeah,
A lot of so-called reports and activity boils down to little more than bumps in the night, inexplicable sounds that are not recorded, that can't be evaluated, or
right.
fleeting glimpses, or um, structures, tree structures, and things like that just don't. Some people are too quick. They're too quick to attribute their
Mm,
experiences and to Sasquatch. One
sure.
time, or they have lay claim to repeated encounters on a regular basis. That always raises a red flag. And I one time was uh, trying to gently steer someone to a little more objective perspective. And I said, well, if you're having these encounters on such a regular, but you must be quite the outdoorsman. You must really. have a keen eye for trace and sign. I said, next time you're out there, um, take your camera, your iPhone or whatever, and snap a picture of, let's say, a deer. There's probably 100 deer, 200 deer for every, or more than that even, for every one Sasquatch out there. They're much more common. Um, and encountered much more frequently. Get me a picture of a deer. In fact, let's make it a buck. Make it a good, nice trophy buck. That should be no problem at all, given the fact
Right.
that you bumping into Sasquatch every weekend. Well,
Right.
that I mean, so my point started to
Right.
sink in, and he became
Yeah.
a bit uncomfortable and awkward. That was it. I mean, if
Yeah.
you're having encounters with this extremely rare, I mean, unless you have established some psychic link or some connection that gives
Right.
you inside track, then people don't forget to realize. They go out on a weekend and they think, well, why aren't I finding Bigfoot? Bigfoot was out here, I'd have seen it, right? Well, you go out on that weekend and how many fox do you see? How many coyotes do you see? How many martins or fishers? You know,
Sure.
a weasel. How many eagles do you see? Things like that.
Right.
We don't see, wildlife is not that common in most places. In some rare exceptional areas or certain circumstances, you're going to have more concentrations. Where you might see a herd of bighorn sheep on the mountainside, or you might see uh, a string of bald eagles along the river when the fish are running, but otherwise, encounters are rare.
Yeah.
And you factor that to the numbers that I think my working rule of thumb is 100 to 200 black bear for every one Sasquatch. So they
Hmm.
probably have similar habitat requirements, similar ranges, but and so if you're in an area that reports to have a black bear population, there's a chance there could be Sasquatch there as well. But how often do you see a black bear? They're called
Correct.
shadows of the forest because they're so elusive. And
Yeah.
you
Is
know,
is
and
there, but you bring up an interesting point. Is there any way, and forgive me if this is a silly question, but is there any way to guesstimate how
how
I know,
many?
yeah,
Yeah, yeah. Well,
like like you were
Dr.
just saying.
Yeah, Dr. Krantz had suggested 100 to 1, a ratio of 100 black
Okay.
bear to every one Sasquatch. I think that's a little too generous, and I would push it closer to 200 to 1.
Mm-hmm.
But the other way I approach it is we have these clues about aspects of its natural um, social structure, its natural behavior. When footprints are found or when sightings are reported, it's typically of solitary individuals or what might be a female with offspring. So they probably are fairly solitary. If you look to the great apes for analogy, no two great ape species have the same social structure. And the closest resemblance to a solitary social unit is the orangutan, where the dominant male, he doesn't monopolize females, but he monopolizes real estate, a certain region, and that happens to correspond to or overlap with the home ranges of several females with offspring in tow, still dependent because they have a longer growth trajectory and are dependent on their mothers for quite a number of years. When they are ready to reproduce, when they've weaned their offspring, then they seek out the attention of the dominant male who advertises his presence with loud calls. And that also wards off potential competitors, interloping males. Although there's an interesting study where they did genetic, paternity tests on the offspring in the region in the area of a dominant male, and found that he was the father in between 60 to 80% of the time. So
Oh,
there were
wow.
some of those other bachelors that were able to have a little
Yeah.
twist on the side. But in any case, so if that holds for Sasquatch, a dominant male and several females, there's evidence also based on GIS analysis of the distribution of reports, and particularly of recognizable individuals, of about 1,000 square miles, a radius of about 36 miles, 36 by 36. So about 1,000 square miles. That makes kind of sense. Of course, that's just a ballpark.
Hmm.
Uh, it's going to vary depending on resources and topography and
Right.
patchiness of the habitat and so forth. But there's also been a GIS analysis that shows remarkable congruence between the range of black bear, their preferred habitat, the bioclimatic factors that determine their range, and and the distribution of Sasquatch. I mean, we assume then by inference by analogy, that they're similar bioclimatic factors. But they probably partition the niche in different ways, different chewing apparatus, different gut physiology, and so forth, different activity patterns.
Sure.
All right, so taking all that now, let back up and look at the physical
All right.
distribution. So one thing, you can look at the distribution of black bear across North America. Okay. Pacific Northwest, down through the Sierras, the Southern Rockies, up to the Canadian Rockies, the Boreal Forest, across the Rocky Mountains in the Intermountain West, the Boreal Forest, the Great Lakes area, Appalachia, all the way hooking down to Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, that area. Black bear. And we can also consider the density of black bear population might reflect the productivity of the habitat, the encroachment of human development and activities and populations. So in British Columbia, 110,000 black bear. In Idaho, 35,000 black bear. In Alabama, 200 black bear.
Hmm.
No. So those are gauges. Then let's take Idaho, for example. You look at Idaho, look at the landforms, look at the forest cover, the resources. Where are the population centers? How is, human population distributed? Look at the black bear distribution within the state. Within that, how many 1,000 square mile plots could you fit roughly? And each of those plots would represent one male and, let's say, three females and a couple of offspring. So maybe 5 to 7. It's going to vary. There's not going to be
Hmm.
a uniform
Right.
pattern. But if you do that for Idaho, you can fit about, 15, let's say, for easy math, times, well, five. Five would be 75. Seven would put it up to what? 105. 105. Well, so based on just those other variables, kind of independently, we come up with 105 Sasquatch in Idaho. Well, I said there were 35,000 black bear in Idaho. So if we use our independent ratio over here of 1 to 200 to 1, that means between, well, let's see, 100 would be 350, 200 would be 175. Well, that's a pretty good match.
Sure.
Well, I've done this exercise with illustrations and slides
Hmm.
where I've talked about the behavioral ecology of Sasquatch, trying to make analogy and inference and draw from examples of eyewitness reports and so forth. But I've repeated it in different states where I've done this presentation, in the Eastern Seaboard, in Appalachia, in the Intermountain West, West Coast. And invariably, those two methods converge remarkably well. They converge. And so
Huh.
I'm pretty confident. So if you add all that up, we're talking probably, and I haven't done it for the composite, but I'd put it between 2 and 3,000. Two and three
Okay.
thousand Sasquatch in North America.
Okay.
North America.
All right.
Now, the reaction often is, well, how can that possibly sustain a population. You have to have a minimum viable population. The notion of a minimum viable population is a rather nebulous one, and it's contingent upon the genetics of the population. If a species has a high level of recessive alleles, and recessives are usually harmful in some way. They're not advantageous. Usually, it's the old adage, if it works, don't change it, don't fix it,
Right.
right? So alleles are variants of a gene, but they're usually in a recessive form, so they're sort of hidden. They're stealthy. They aren't expressed unless they combine as a recessive homozygous individual, where two recessive genes come together and then they're expressed. So that way, it's a rare for not rare, but it's statistically less frequent, and it's a way that nature kind of experiments, keeps a
Hmm.
few variants in the population so that if conditions change, there might be a time when that variant is advantageous. But
Hmm.
all else being equal, you kind of want to stick to what works. Well,
Right.
populations that have, but sometimes those recessive genes also can be extremely harmful. So, sickle cell anemia is a homozygous recessive condition. And that's why it's kind of hard to get rid of it, because you can have heterozygotes carrying without the expression of that gene. And so amongst the offspring, there'll be homozygous recessive showing up every once in a while. Well, if a population has a high recessive load, then inbreeding can be a real problem.
Hmm.
Humans, that's why we have taboos against marrying siblings or even marrying close cousins, because the chances of those familial traits popping up is in a homozygous recessive offspring are very high. In populations that don't have a genetic load, a significant load, that is, they have very few harmful recessive genes, they can tolerate inbreeding. They can tolerate low numbers. When the mountain gorilla went through one of its smallest bottlenecks, there were only about 250 individuals. And yet they came out on the other side. Well, they studied their genes very carefully and found that they were very tolerant of inbreeding. They had very few harmful recessive traits. They had already been strongly selected against those traits, apparently. And so now they could come through a narrow bottleneck. Now they've rebounded up to a couple of thousand with no signs of inbreeding depression. So when you go to the literature and you look up minimum viable population, you get kind of this mamby-pamby, beat around the
Right.
bush. But then they have to offer something. So they say a generally accepted population size for terrestrial vertebrates is about 1,000 individuals. Well,
Hmm.
terrestrial vertebrates, that's everything from a little tiny tree frog to a blue whale or
Well,
an
that was my
elephant,
question.
or to an elephant, not to a blue whale, that's not terrestrial, but to an elephant. So obviously there's a lot of slop in that estimate.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
if you can use that as a jumping off point, if we've got 2 to 3 thousand Sasquatch, and we don't have any really isolated populations, that range I described is remarkably contiguous. There's very little interruption. There's the potential for gene flow. A Sasquatch can
Right.
strike out across, a young male that's been forced out of his natal territory can strike out in a night or two, cover, probably 60 miles, 70 miles,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
they're gonna move along corridors or cross over, and I think that's where and Grover, Dr. Krantz also suggested that's where some of the anomalous reports, what he called rogue males, were young adult males that were striking out to find their fortune somewhere. And so
Hmm.
they were sometimes seen in otherwise inexplicable areas that weren't prime
That
habitat.
that is fascinating. That is quite an explanation. I
Yeah.
didn't realize that. So yeah, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
And like I said, we could talk forever, but I don't we've been talking for a while and I don't want to continue to take a lot of your time, but
Sure.
I have one more question I would
Okay.
really like to ask you pertaining to the size of these things.
Right.
I think I read somewhere, and I hate to say that, oh, I read this, but I wanted to
Yeah.
ask you, as far as the subject pictured in the Patterson-Gimlin film, I believe some size estimates were created. And I think I read somewhere in the range of 7 feet tall to 600 to 700 pounds. Does that sound accurate?
It does. It does. We have the scale, which is the foot, which left the footprints on the sandbar. So they measure, they've always been reported as 14 and a half inches. But in my examination of good first generation replicas of the original, which do still exist, but we just don't have access to them at the moment, 15 inches is closer to an accurate measure of the foot. Um, and that's important because that half inch difference in the scale can, if you're using that unit as the scale for height, you're going to repeat it at least four, if not five times. And so that half inch turns into a potential error margin of 2.5 inches.
Hmm.
So, and the other problem is what has often been done. There is one particular frame where the foot is very vertical, and as such is taken as a better representation of the actual length of the foot. The problem is because of its vertical position, it's catching the sun and it's grossly overexposed on the
Hmm.
film because of that. And so when you overexpose something, it tends to kind of glow and the edges get a little fuzzy. And so when that foot is used as a scale, there's the potential of introducing um, uh, the appearance of too long of a scale.
Okay.
Yeah. So when you apply that, in other words, then you underestimate the
Okay.
height. Well, there's another frame that's very similar to that one, where the opposite foot is up, and it is at a little bit of an angle, but it's just at an angle to the sun, so the bottom of the foot looks much darker, and the edges are crisp and sharp. Well, you can take those two frames and line up the body from head, the head, the shoulders, the arms, and everything, line them up perfectly, and then take those 2 feet. When you put them side by side, you can see that what I've described is that inflation. So if you
Hmm.
take that foot, the second foot, with nice crisp edges I mean, to the point where you can see the individual toe pads and the toe stems, and you use that as a scale, you get a much more accurate reading. And then if you do that, even if you only use 14 and a half inches as the scale, you still get something that's in the range. And there we're dealing with a walking height where the individual is on very flexed hips and knees and ankles. The Groucho walk epitomized.
Right. Right.
That's going to change its overall height. I mean, a walking height versus a standing height, it can be upwards of 4 inches difference if you're in that real
Right.
exaggerated Groucho crouch. Well, so you take that into account, you put that foot, and I put her height somewhere between about 6'8" and 7 foot. So about a
Okay.
4 inch margin of error. But there have been some recent suggestions she's only 6'2". There was a photogrammetric analysis that was conducted on Expedition Sasquatch that I think was misleading. And so I put her about 6'8" to 7 foot. Well, if we take that, and 6'8" was where John Green put her. for a standing height. And in his book on the track of the Sasquatch, he's got these very nice figures where he's done an approximation of a tracing of the figure, but then with careful measurements on the projected image from that frame, those frames, he's done depth and breadth measures of all the body segments, allowing for a little bit of hair. Her hair is pretty tight, so it's not going to
Hmm.
change things really appreciably. Well, I took those figures that I was satisfied with, and at least to get a ballpark here, and modeled her body as if it were simply a series of cylinders. So made approximate cylinder for the leg and the thigh and the torso and the arm segments and the head, you know. Now there's obviously it's a rough estimate, but again, it's in the
Sure.
ballpark. It's in the
Yeah.
ballpark. It's not an error by an order of magnitude or anything.
Sure.
Well, we know from studies what the density of a typical body is, composite tissue, and so knowing the volume, we can, using the density, we can estimate the mass and thereby the weight, right? And I
Hmm.
and doing that for 6'8", come up with just over 700 pounds, about 730
Okay.
pounds. So that works pretty well. If we had a creature that had 17-inch feet, if you've seen these, what I take to be the males that are in that 17 to 19-inch range, they have much broader feet for their length as well. I think they're more massive. They have more testosterone. They have the male physique, and you would be up to another foot and a half, maybe 8.5 feet. I think 9. It's about, you get nothing. I don't think anything credible is beyond 10 feet. Actually,
Okay.
beyond 9 feet.
Yeah, I was kind of curious what a range might be.
Yeah, because the biomechanics, you get up to 12, 14 feet tall, and not only are the biomechanics prohibitive, the materials, the bones, it's why an elephant doesn't look like a mouse. It doesn't look like a giant mouse because a giant mouse's skeleton wouldn't support, so an elephant has to look more like an elephant with thick tree trunk limbs and stout torso and neck and so forth, as opposed to the dainty skeleton of a little lightweight featherweight mouse.
Yeah.
Something 14 feet tall, it just is, it's prohibitive unless there's gross differences in the way it looks, because that, as we talked about, the mass is growing disproportionate to those linear dimensions. So adding another foot onto something that big, adds another 150, 200, 300 pounds.
Mm.
And so a 14 footer would be probably in excess of 2,500 pounds. And
Wow.
yeah, and so that's why I think that's unrealistic. I think
Yeah.
the footprint of the male that was in the area where Patty was filmed, I think was the dominant male. His tracks were found repeatedly by different people. 17 inches long. I think that suggests 8.5 feet tall and probably 1,200 pounds.
Okay.
1,200 pounds, though. You think about it, that's the size of a moose.
Oh,
A
definitely.
moose.
Yeah.
And it's like,
It's enormous.
if you've ever been up next to a moose, I mean, it's like something that stepped out of the Pleistocene, out of the Ice Age, onto the screen, or into the forest. It's
Yeah.
just it's like I used to love when we had our local fair, the Eastern Idaho Fair. One of the exhibits I enjoyed the most was to go and see the draft horses,
Mm.
because they were
Hmm.
just amazing. These masses of animation. I
Oh, yeah.
mean, these huge creatures, and an adult Sasquatch isn't too far off that.
That's
Not quite.
incredible.
Yeah, it
That
is.
is incredible. I appreciate that explanation of that because as long is I have paid attention to this and read various books, yours included, and watched programs. I never really, from a true professional, was sure of what a guesstimation or an estimation was of Sasquatch. So,
Right.
I think we'll kind of bring it to conclusion here. And one of the things after listening to you and speaking to you is I think credible people like yourself bring great validity to this topic. And one of the things I'll say, it hasn't been disproven. Like this has not
Right.
been disproven. So that's one of the other issues or items that kind of pushes me to keep an open mind to consider it. Is that after all these years and all this time of hearing evidence and studies from individuals like you and not being shown to be fraudulent or a hoax or disproven, it keeps you thinking.
It does. It does. Yeah. And that's another whole nother dimension. I mean, in addition to the remarkable question that this presents, are there other man-like species coexisting still on the planet? It also raises some really interesting sort of introspective questions about the advance of science, the way in which um, perceived controversy is sidelined and not given fair opportunities and to be seriously considered. That it's poo-pooed. That it's you know I've been on the receiving end of that now for a long time, and I'm very thick-skinned, but I have to caution students who express interest in diving into the deep end prematurely about the
Hmm.
consequences of that decision, and that it may be a bit brash under the current circumstances. Now, like we were discussing, is beginning to change.
Right.
But as Thomas Kuhn in his very influential book, The Scientific Revolutions, said, Thomas Kuhn, who coined the term paradigm shift, also qualified that notion by the observation that sometimes it takes a whole generation of academicians to pass away, literally pass away before a new idea can take root and flourish and be considered fairly and objectively.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
we're still on the cusp of that. Another 5 years, I think the upcoming generation of students who have been raised with the possibility that such a creature might exist and have not been indoctrinated with the old school paradigm, the single species hypothesis. But still, there are the journal editors, the society presidents, the deans, the department chairs that stand as gatekeepers, and some of them are less than open-minded and progressive
That's a
thinking.
phrase I was going to use. Open, not
Yeah.
open-minded.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, in
Well, that's
addition to being a professor there, you kind of referenced it earlier, is you're involved in not only this research, but maybe associations or conferences affiliated with your research. Is there
Mhm.
anything you wanted to mention about any of those or
Well,
anything along those
yeah.
lines?
I being a somewhat singular voice within academia, there aren't very
Right.
many of us. I have sort of become the go-to guy for that perspective, and I appreciate the opportunity to keep it grounded and keep it objective and rational. Um, my Facebook page, which is under my full name, Don Jeffrey Meldrum, lists. I use that just as a bulletin board for announcements of upcoming events and so forth, as
Okay.
well as if you scan back down a ways, there's actually a calendar for the whole year of the various events that I'll be speaking at. These are mostly the kind of homespun conventions and festivals, but I'm also on many occasions invited to speak at museums, in classrooms, at libraries, in on university campuses, in various organizations, tribal organizations. This weekend, I'll be going to Lander, Wyoming, where I man a booth at the invitation of the Wyoming Game and Fish Department about Sasquatch, together with my good
Wow.
friend and colleague, John Myanzinski, who's a wildlife consultant out of Atlantic City, just south of Lander, has had some experiences of his own. And he and I spent many, many, many months and weeks and months and if not years in the field together, investigating various aspects of this all over the place, all over the Western
Yeah.
United States. So
Yeah.
yeah, so it's yeah, invite you to take a look at that and
Very good. Yep.
looking into that.
It's tell me the name of the Facebook page again.
Don, D-O-N, Jeffrey, Jeffrey, Meldrum,
All
just
right,
my
perfect.
full name. Yeah.
Perfect. All right. I'm sure people will take a look at that. I know I
Well, good,
definitely will. Did you
good.
want to I found my book. I read it years ago.
Excellent.
Did you want to mention anything about your book? I
Well,
mean,
sure. It's still
excellent.
some might think it might be too dated. It's not. 2006 was when it was published, but still the content is extremely pertinent and it provides an excellent primer for anyone well, old, new or experienced. There's a lot of meat on the bones and but it's very accessible. You may learn a few new words, add to your
Yes.
vocabulary, and
Yes,
that's good. That's always good. But also, it's very profusely illustrated, so it really draws you in. I think and engages you. I'm a very visual
it
teacher and
does.
learner, and so it can be had through Amazon or through at Barnes and Noble's bookstores. ParadiseK.com also carries it, and they've got a lot of other interesting things, including my field guide to the Sasquatch and also to other relic hominoids around the world. And my, if you've got young scholars, young
Hmm.
enthusiasts. I also have penned a series of activity workbooks for young learners, but they're very engaging for adults too, especially novices and experienced alike. But especially if you're new to the subject matter, again, it presents the history, the paleontology, the ecology, the biology, the culture for each of these relic hominoids around the world, very specific to their region, their native animals, whose tracks might be commingled with theirs, and so on.
Where could
Um,
listeners find those?
that would be most easily found at Paradise K Publishers.
Okay.
It's at, if you just go to Paracay, K as in a an inlet. It's a
Okay.
nautical term, I guess. Um, but
Very good.
parakay.com, and they have a whole section on Bigfoot items, and
Okay.
I think you'll be pleasantly surprised by the variety of things. Great for stuffing stockings. I still
There you
didn't
go.
stocking stuffers.
We've been talking
Christmas
so
is
long.
Yeah, boy, little glitch there in the
Yeah.
software. I have to reboot.
Okay.
But
Excellent. That's
yeah,
good to know. Well, is there anything before we wrap it up, is there anything that you would like to circle back on or touch on, or do you have any final comments you'd like to mention?
no, we covered
We
quite a
sure did.
diversity. I think a lot of things. So you know, it's just if this is a topic that's new to you, just go into it without the baggage of preconception and unreliable information. There's a lot of stuff online. I would just caution you to use prudence and be circumspect in what you accept, what you entertain as reliable information, and likewise with the documentaries. Even there's some good ones, but there's take the things that you see with a grain of salt.
Right.
There are just a lot of people who will either intentionally hoax or will perpetuate questionable material just to get clicks.
Yeah.
And that's unfortunate, but it's the world we live in, and you have to, I try to teach my students to evaluate their sources of information. And where you're walking around with this little mini supercomputer in your pocket, take full advantage of it, but you got to be careful. You got to learn to discriminate reliable from not so reliable sources of information. And I
Well
think
said.
have fun with it, because it's a
Yep.
fascinating topic, and the journey, the the road to discovery should be as intriguing as the destination itself.
Yep. Outstanding. Well, Dr. Meldrum, I wanted to just thank you again. I greatly appreciate your time. I greatly appreciate your knowledge that you shared today. And please continue to keep up the good work.
Certainly, will do. Thanks again.
All right, thank you. And let me transition to my listeners. Let me just ask and continue to remind you to like, share, subscribe to my social media so I can continue to bring you high quality guests and experts in their field like Dr. Meldrum today. So I appreciate you listeners as well, and everybody stay safe out there. Thank you. The Right to Remain Silent podcast is brought to you by Streetwise 360 Studios. I would like to again thank today's guest for sharing the story right here on the podcast. Please remember to like, follow, share, and recommend us so that I can continue to bring you high caliber guests sharing their experiences just like we heard today. If your law enforcement agency is interested in training provided by Streetwise 360, or if you know someone that has an interesting law enforcement story to share, please contact me via the website, www.streetwise-360.com, www.streetwise-360.com.